Good evening, everyone. Good evening to all our guests for the first session of Talking History 2022. My name is Dr. Christy Kokigi. I'm the Director of Public Engagement here at the History Trust of South Australia. For those of you who don't know the History Trust or know of all of our work, you may know of our museums. So we run museums, being the South Australian Maritime Museum, the National Motor Museum, the Migration Museum. We run the Centre of Democracy in collaboration with the State Library. We also do an awful lot of work with community museums and historical societies all across the state, including administering significant grant rounds and grant programs, to help them achieve, to help them care for their collections and to make those stories of South Australia more discoverable all across the state. We also produce South Australia's annual History Festival, which is coming up in May of this year. So we're busy putting the final touches on the History Festival for this year, as well as the Bay de Burwood, one of Australia's significant motoring events. We've still got a few people joining. So I'm just going to, before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge that the land we meet on tonight, and certainly the land we're broadcasting to you from tonight, is Kaurna land, and that the History Trust of South Australia respects the primary place of Aboriginal people in the history of this place. We certainly acknowledge that our story, our shared history, commenced long before Governor Hindmarsh proclaimed the new province of South Australia and established colonial government in 1836. And certainly we acknowledge that Aboriginal people have a long history that extends millennia into the past. And it's building a shared understanding of this history and our history, which is crucial to reconciliation and creating a positive future for all of us here in South Australia. So yes, lovely to have you. Welcome to 2022. Obviously, we had hoped to be bringing Talking History to you in person again this year, but Omicron had other ideas. So for the majority of 2022, we will be bringing you Talking History online again in this usual format. We are planning a few exciting in-person events, so sign up to the mailing list if you haven't already, and we will make sure that you get details of those events. But it really is lovely to be able to continue sharing our love of South Australian history and these fascinating stories with all of you right into your lounge rooms. So that's enough from me. So we're all here actually to listen to Corinne. So now I'm going to introduce and hand over to our speaker for tonight. So Corinne Ball is a curator at our Migration Museum. Some of you are probably quite aware of the museum. It's a fabulous place in the city. And Corinne discovered this topic, or discovered Mabel, I should say, way back in 2015 when she was researching an exhibition on the Destitute Asylum, which is now the site of the Migration Museum. And for those of you who don't know Corinne, she's a voracious researcher, and she chased this information down every rabbit hole she could, and she was thoroughly fascinated with Mabel and her amazing story. And so it's really, really wonderful that we're here tonight to actually enjoy and hear in greater detail that research. So Corinne, as I said, is curator at our Migration Museum. She's produced many, many exhibitions. She's written numerous short articles online for places like In Daily and blogging platforms like Medium. And she has, I'm told, 3 upcoming book chapters in museology and history titles. So stay tuned for those. And she's presented at state, national and international conferences about South Australian history, the Destitute Asylum and disability history. So look, without further ado, Corinne, I'm going to hand over you to take us down the rabbit hole of this fascinating story about Mabel Worley. Thank you.
All righty. Well, hello, everybody. Could I have my first slide, please, Catherine? Thank you. All right. So this is Mabel, Strumpet, sinner, circus star, uncovering the dramatic, mysterious and tragic life of a destitute asylum girl. This is Mabel, not at one of her best moments. This is her in 1908. She had a very long and checkered life. She has incredible adventures along the way. She's born in 1872, dies in 1937. And along the way, she navigates love, loss. She falls into a life of crime, essentially spends the last 30 years of her life living rough on the streets of Melbourne. And yet she rubs shoulders with some of the big stars of the day. Her family runs a circus. She travels. It's all very, very exciting. So roll up, roll up. This is a sensational story of family, sex, secrets, and stardom. Next. So who was Elizabeth Mabel Worley, known as Mabel? She was born on Hindley Street in Adelaide's West End. This is a picture from only a couple of years before she was born, and her family ran a boarding house, which is unfortunately just off the shot to the right. And this is on the right-hand side of the screen is the Benevolent Asylum at Ballarat, where she died in 1937. So she's a very, very ordinary person. It's a very simple life. She's a nobody. You could say, you know, in just one sentence, she is a working class girl. She's born at the edge of the British Empire. She has an illegitimate child at 16 at the Destitute Asylum, and then later falls into a life of booze and crime and dies alone as a sad old woman. In this, her life is very similar to other people at the time. But if we look beyond the easy classifications, we can find a really rich story of an interesting woman, a bad girl. She's really kind of painted as a bad girl from early on, but she makes her way in the world as best she can. And it's a world that chews up women like her and spits them out. But she has spark and she has spirit, and that keeps her going in the face of extreme adversity. She adapts, she dissembles, she acts, quite literally, and she endures. So as Christy said, I met Mabel when we were doing the current exhibition about the Destitute Asylum, which we did in 2015 to 16. And in this picture here, there are 4 different family stories in the gallery, and the one circled in green is Mabel's Story. And so I first met Mabel at State Records in the many, many linear kilometres of records that they keep up there, and my amazing colleague, Dr. Nikki Sullivan, and I were looking through the registers of the asylum, looking for stories to tell in this new version of the gallery that tells the story about buildings in our site. And we found Mabel. So, next page, please. Her story starts off with her being a strumpet. It was one of thousands of stories that you can find in the asylum registers, and the detail that caught our eye is this one here, which I hope you can read. Basically, it says that, so this is her coming into the Destitute Asylum in 1888. She's pregnant, she's 16, she's a state child herself because she's been surrendered to the care of the State Children's Council by her mother for being uncontrollable, which in that context usually means sexually active. She's gone into service at a family house in the hills for the Giles family, who are quite wealthy, and she comes back here some months later and she's pregnant. And the detail that caught our eye is that the family that she is working for pay the State Children's Council £150 in consideration of all demands, which is a really, really, really unusual admission of paternity. So unusual that we had to know more. Next slide. So it goes downhill from there. She has her baby here at the Destitute Asylum in the lying-in home, the beautiful 2-storey building on the other side of the courtyard. And when her daughter is a toddler, she's accused of being a prostitute, and her daughter is removed from her. In fact, her brother writes a letter accusing her of being a prostitute, and the State Children's Department does a welfare check, and they find her in bed with a young man and her daughter at a foster mother's house. So her daughter is removed, and Mabel writes a series of letters begging for her back. And this is one, it says 1890, but it's actually 1891. In her distress, she has mistimed it. Basically, she has to grovel. This is the first page of a 4-page letter where she basically debases herself to get her child back. She writes these few lines: in sincere regret at my past conduct towards you concerning my child, now at state school. I have no one to blame but myself. The loss of her has well nigh broken my heart, and I've thought very seriously since. So basically, she promises that she will be a good girl from now on, and she will be respectable, and that please can I have my child back. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. And so later that year, she takes different tack and she gets married to a young man who's very slightly higher than her in social standing. Next slide. And in the short term, this is a successful manoeuvre. She marries this young man called Henry Hawkins, and his details are kind of halfway down. He starts writing letters to the State Children's Department asking for his stepdaughter back, literally the day after the wedding. They get married on something like the 14th of July, and the 15th of July, he's writing letters saying, I'd like my stepdaughter, please. And that seems to work. For a little while, she gets her daughters back, and gets her daughter back, and they live happily as a little family throughout most of the 1890s. And then in 1899, this is the page from the Register of Children, the Ledger of Children boarded out. It's noted that the family is moving to Collingwood in Melbourne. And that's it. After that, they do not appear in these records at all again. So what happened to them? This is the problem that I spent 5 years banging my head against. Because there was something about Mabel that just made me want to find out more about her. These letters that she had to write, the letters that her husband writes, they are doing their best to try and fight this system that they have little power in. The State Children's Council had total authority once a child was surrendered to them, or once a child had been removed as unsuitable. So they were applying to get their child back. They didn't have the right to get their child back. So she's up, she's in a terrible position. She's up a creek with no paddle. So what happens after 1899? How did I solve this? I was sheer bloody mindedness. So something about her struck with me. And in the 5 years since we opened the exhibition in 2016, I just kept digging. Every now and then, not full-time or anything like that, but just every now and then I'd have a go on, Trove and Ancestry and all these other things, and Genealogy Essay and all these amazing resources, and just kept digging and digging and digging, and came up with nothing, absolutely nothing, for at least 3 or 4 years. So I decided to try from the other end. I knew from Mabel's brother's children's children that she died in 1937 at Ballarat Asylum. I also knew that her brother had run a moderately successful circus for some decades in the early 1900s. So I thought, how does that work? Kept sitting on that for another couple of years. Next slide. So tried to unpick this circus connection. I had to look further into the lives of her brothers. So this is not just her story, this is the Worley siblings' story. She was one of 7, one of 6 surviving. And these are her brother Frank's two sons. On the left is Lindsay, the younger child, and on the right is Roy, the older child. And I actually found these illustrations very late in the game. But yes, it shows that there was this amazing little circus, and I had to find out more. But it was really, really difficult, because circus is really difficult to research. Circus folk are quite secretive, and there's lots of name changing. It's actually really difficult to unpick. So I couldn't make any connection with Mabel herself until about 2 years ago. I was performing a Hail Mary search of the Public Records Office online, which is just amazing. All this digitisation and online stuff is incredible. And I decided to just try putting in every woman's record in the Register of Female Criminals who was South Australian. And I just was trolling through them and found this woman, Elizabeth Mabel Daly. And I was like, well, her middle name's Mabel. It's Elizabeth Mabel, which is my Mabel's name. She's approximately the same age. And she says she's a circus rider, and she was born in South Australia. So this is what I found. And as you can see, it is just this huge mess of over 50 incarcerations in the 30-year period in Melbourne. And it was just mind-blowing. There's 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 different names represented. It's dozens of offences and small periods in jail. And I think I really just kind of sat on this for about 2 years, because I couldn't unpick it. It was just too dense. So during lockdown in 2020, I decided that this was the time, this was going to be my lockdown baby. I was going to try and work it all out. So I got all this and put it in a spreadsheet and started to really look at the names and the dates and the gaps between incarcerations. And so this told me that in 1905, Mabel got 4 years hard labour as an accessory to larceny. She told the police then that she was a circus rider, but in none of the reporting around the offence was her husband or her daughter. So what on earth had happened? Took a while to decode that as well. Next slide. So the handwritten entries that you saw on the previous page, they form this impenetrable network of names and offences and sentences and all these things. But with the spreadsheet, it became really obvious that there had been this massive event in 1905 where she got these 4 years, and that when she got out in 1908, everything changed. It took me a long time to unpick what had happened, and you can see here the photos. So on the left is her first mugshot when she goes in, and on the right in 1908 is her just before release. And she changes so much in this period. I mean, she essentially almost looks like a different woman, but it was the first time I'd actually come face to face with her. And it really just kind of struck me to my core. So I had to find out what this pivotal event had been and what the trail of devastation meant. Next slide. So, quick intermission. I'm not going to give away too many spoilers about what happens next, because otherwise it will spoil everything for you, but I will give you a rough outline of what you can expect coming up. And it's a story that, as I uncovered all these details, I just couldn't believe. I kept on texting Nikki and saying, now there's Russian spies, and now there's snake charmers, and now there's all this other stuff. And it just became more and more astonishing every time I did more research. So next slide. Some of the surprises along the way were Mabel's own career on the stage, the vaudeville stage. There was a hint buried in the stuff at State Records. And for some reason, I hadn't noticed it, and it didn't go anywhere for a long time. And then when I started backtracking and looking at this Barton Circus collection and looking for Barton and looking for Mabel Barton, which is not her birth name or the name she dies under, Trove brought up an amazing array of things. So she has this career, not as Mabel Barton, though, as somebody completely different on the vaudeville stage in Adelaide and beyond. And it doesn't stop there. The whole family has this huge vaudeville and circus and performance history that was completely hidden, which was really fascinating. Another fantastic thing that she does along the way is she stages a one-woman prison break from Port Lincoln Jail, because she's absolutely desperate for a drink at that point, which I'll go into later. She wiggles out of sticky situations by pretending to be, at one point, from Devon, at another point from Scotland. She puts on all these airs and graces. She pretends to have just arrived from London when she's actually just come from Sydney. She does all these kind of little sleight of hand moves. And then later, as the family circus story evolves, it is literally snake charmers, Russian spies, daisy baits, pedestrianism, cycling across Cataract Gorge, all sorts of stuff. Amazing things. Next slide. So along the way, I found out the fascinating origins of the family showbiz gene. So this lovely picture on the left, which I'm broadcasting from here, is White's Assembly Rooms, which was on King William Street in Adelaide. It had lots of different names. It changed hands a few times. This is it around 1890, I think. So the family performed there. Various members of the family performed there, including Mabel's uncle, who was a well-known acrobat, a cousin who was a well-known globe walker, sword climber, climbing a ladder of swords, all that sort of thing. And on the right-hand side, this isn't the family troupe or anybody that they're directly related to, but this is the sort of advertising material that this kind of vaudeville circus, it's not really polite theatre world has, but it's, it's the next rung down. They call themselves polite vaudeville because that indicates that it's family friendly. So yeah, there's things like trick cycling, there's wire work, there's lady serio comics, so they sing all these, you know, sentimental ballads and all this kind of stuff. There's people putting on Hibernian accents, all sorts of impersonations, all that sort of thing. It's a very, very rich world that I knew nothing about until I started researching this. Next slide. So these are some of the people in what I came to think of as the Greasepaint Network. So once I started digging, I realised that there are all these connections. It's like a big network of families and acts and people and theatres and promoters. They all know each other. They all either love, hate, owe money, owe their big break to each other. They're all connected. And these are just a few of this cast of thousands. So on the left, the two young ladies are Cora and Ina Milne, who are the children of a very famous Melbourne actor from the 1860s, 70s and 80s, and they're also young performers themselves. The middle is little Joey Raphael, who's her cousin Caroline's husband, obviously in his later days. So he is also, his father was a Colombian equestrian who came to Australia and had several children who also performed. And then he marries Mabel's cousin, who he meets through her father, who's a trick cyclist and acrobat. There's all these connections. And on the right is Jockey Jack McDonald, the famous lady rough rider, who actually preferred to be called Jack and didn't think of themselves as a woman, and was constantly in the press for wearing men's clothes. It was even debated in the Legislative Chamber in Melbourne that it was not actually illegal for her to do so, for them to do so. I've been really trying to get my idea about how Jack might have wanted to have been thought about now, because of course they were constantly referred to as a woman, but not in the newspaper. But I think, you know, I've tried to think about them in a much more nuanced way that might respect how they wanted to be thought of. But yes, they were an extremely accomplished rider and a very unusual addition to her brother's troupe, Mabel's brother's troupe. Next slide. So it's not just Mabel's life of, you know, grim destitution and having an illegitimate baby and all this sort of stuff. It's actually a look at a very lesser documented world of small Australian circuses. This one on the left is Fitzgerald's Circus in Tasmania around 1900. Fitzgerald is one of the massive names. But for, you know, all the Fitzgeralds and Burtons and all the big names, there are dozens and dozens of much smaller family-run affairs. And again, they're all interrelated, interconnected. There are feuds, there are marriages, there are betrayals, there are illegitimate babies. There's all sorts of stuff going on. So it's this kind of undocumented world. And what I found really fascinating is that this period, so Mabel is born in the 1870s, her daughter's born in 1888, and there's this stage world around the turn of the century that is really grappling with the introduction of moving pictures. So the first feature-length moving picture is filmed in Melbourne, the Tree Street, the Kelly Gang, and within a handful of years, it is sweeping little circuses like this, little travelling acts. It is totally changing the landscape of live entertainment in Australia and elsewhere. So it's a really fascinating period about how all these little circuses and the bigger ones try and adapt to this cultural creep from moving pictures, and then later in the 1920s, talking pictures. So I didn't know anything about that. Again, extremely fascinating. It's been, the big circuses have been researched a lot by a gentleman called Mark St. Leon, who is descended from the very famous St. Leon clan, who is tangentially related to Mabel. But yeah, there are so many of these small circuses that it's impossible to track them all. It's just wonderful. So, and on the right, this is Barton's Follies. Sorry, back one, sorry. This is Barton's Follies. This is a picture taken only a couple of years after Mabel dies. This is 1939. I can't remember where it is. It's somewhere like Echuca. But so this is her brother Frank's little circus with his little boys, becomes this this show called Barton's Follies, which goes up until the 50s. and they're very influential. And it's very much a kind of high-kicking, pretty girls, a snappy song, all that sort of stuff. So they're trying to compete all the way up through the 40s and 50s with cinema, and eventually, they have to close, but they go for a long time. So that's her brother and her brother's sons. They run this for a long time. So it's a fascinating world, forgotten world that, with TV and movies we don't think about at all anymore. Next slide. Thank you. So yes, lowlights. This is Mabel, 1935. She is in her 60s. It says she's born December 1873, but she's not. She's born 1872. She constantly lies about her age. She's always trying to shave a few years off. A lady never says how old she is anyway. This is her last mugshot, and it just breaks my heart to look at her at this point. She's had this astonishing life, but by this point, she's lost everybody. She outlives all of her siblings, one of her husbands. She has spent 23 years in prison, various different prisons, South Australia and Melbourne. She loses pretty much everyone close to her, either through her drinking or their death or disease. TB plays a massive role in the family story. She falls into a really quite serious meths habit at a time during the Depression when meths, Pinky, Plinky Plonk, all sorts of names, is sweeping the world, the British Empire in particular. And so she is desperate half the time, and the other half of the time she's in prison. So she's alone on the streets of Melbourne. Basically, in the last few years, she's kind of shuttling around these very small number of locations in the Carlton area, living in parks, going into Pentridge, coming out of Pentridge, getting arrested, going back into Pentridge, going out of Pentridge. She is quite tiny by the end. She's described earlier on as a woman of good height. She's 5'3". And I think that kind of talks to how she kind of, elevates herself and uses her posture, all that kind of stuff, to appear something that she isn't. So yes, it is quite a sad tale in many places, but she also finds delight where she can. At one point later in life, she's arrested in the middle of the night for dancing in Victoria Street in Melbourne, dancing in the middle of the street. And I like to think that's a high moment. She has all sorts of options, but she chooses not to exert them. And in many other ways, she has no options. There's no dole. She may or may not be eligible for a pension by this point. So one of the things I've really tried to unpick is how this changing society also deals with people like Mabel. And in the end, it's really interesting and relevant to think about her through today's lens. We like to think that, we live in a country where this sort of thing can't happen anymore, and yet we still have homelessness. Women over 50 are the largest growing group of homeless people in Australia. Now, I'm over 50. That really shocked me. So, we like to think that we've got all these modern safety nets, and we do, but yet there are many people who are still extremely vulnerable and discarded by society. So there's lots to think about with Mabel as herself, but also in a broader context. So the burning question that I'm sure lots of you are going to ask is, what happens to Mabel's daughter? And I'm afraid I'm not going to tell you here, because otherwise you'll have all the good stuff. This is not Mabel's daughter, but this is someone very similar to her. I can tell you that there is the stage involved. It is again, hair-curling tale of stardom and travel and tragedy and all sorts of amazing things. Yes, you'll have to buy the book to find out. It's coming out in May. We'll be having a launch here at the museum on the 19th of May in the evening as part of the History Festival. Next slide, please. This is my beautiful cover. I don't have a price point yet, but I think it's either $30 or $35, something like that. So this is a beautiful cover. I'm very, very pleased. It is indeed a dramatic, mysterious and tragic life. And I hope you end up reading it, and I hope that you love Mabel as much by the end as I do. I don't like her necessarily very much. I think she would be that aunt that you were always warned about. You're going to end up like her. But she just keeps going. She has this astonishing strength of character. she does things that you would never believe for somebody who lives who starts off a very simple life in dusty South Australia at the arse end of the empire, and yet there's this lost world of public and private lives with the circus and vaudeville and performing, and this kind of gritty underworld that's kind of rubbing next to the 19th century morality. It's just fascinating, and I love her very much, and I hope you do too. That's it.